The expansive hearing room of the House Judiciary Committee hummed with anticipation as spectators, staff, and media filled every available seat. The atmosphere was charged with tension even before the day's main witnesses had been sworn in. This wasn't just another routine congressional hearing. It was the culmination of months of partisan conflict over proposed legislation on election administration, and everyone knew the fireworks were about to begin. At the witness table sat former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi, her blonde hair perfectly styled, dressed in a crimson blazer that seemed chosen to command attention. At 58, Bondi had built her post-government career as a conservative legal analyst and advocate, frequently appearing on television to defend traditional approaches to election security. Having served as Florida's top law enforcement officer for 8 years, before becoming a prominent surrogate for Republican campaigns, Bondi brought both institutional credibility and partisan passion to her testimony. The committee members sat on the elevated dais, divided physically and ideologically along party lines. Among the Democratic members, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett from Texas reviewed her notes with focused intensity. The 43-year-old former civil rights attorney had established herself as one of the most effective questioners on the committee since joining Congress, combining her legal background with an ability to translate complex issues into accessible language. Today, dressed in a structured navy blue suit with a simple gold necklace, nothing in her demeanor revealed the strategy she had prepared for her upcoming exchange with Bondi. The hearing's nominal purpose was to examine federal election administration proposals, but everyone in the room understood the real agenda. Republicans were building a case for stricter voting requirements, while Democrats were defending measures to expand ballot access. As the invited expert witness for the Republican majority, Bondi was expected to provide authoritative support for claims of election vulnerabilities that justified tighter restrictions. After preliminary statements, several Republican members directed friendly questions to Bondi, allowing her to expand on prepared talking points about election security concerns. Her testimony painted a picture of election systems vulnerable to manipulation and fraud, though she carefully avoided making specific allegations about past elections that might require factual substantiation. When Democratic members began their questioning, the tone shifted noticeably. Initial exchanges grew increasingly tense as Bondi dismissed questions about the impact of proposed restrictions on minority voters as political theater and playing the race card. By the time the chairman recognized the gentlewoman from Texas for her 5 minutes of questioning, the hearing had already devolved into the partisan confrontation everyone had anticipated. Crockett began with a disarming smile and professional tone. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Bondi, I appreciate you appearing before our committee today." Bondi nodded slightly in acknowledgement, her expression guarded after the increasingly contentious exchanges with previous Democratic questioners. "I'd like to start by establishing some baseline facts," Crockett continued. "In your opening statement, you mentioned that our election systems are riddled with vulnerabilities that create significant opportunities for fraud. Is that an accurate characterization of your testimony?" "Yes, Congresswoman," Bondi replied firmly. "Based on my experience as Florida's Attorney General and my work since then, I believe our current systems have serious security gaps that need to be addressed." Crockett nodded thoughtfully. "And would you agree that any policy recommendations should be based on actual evidence rather than theoretical concerns?" "Of course," Bondi answered. Though I would add that we shouldn't wait for widespread fraud to occur before addressing obvious vulnerabilities. It seemed like a routine exchange setting up basic parameters. But those familiar with Crockett's questioning style recognized she was establishing points that would become relevant later. Before diving deeper into this explosive confrontation that has everyone talking, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you the most revealing political showdowns with context and analysis you won't find elsewhere. Turn on notifications so you never miss our latest uploads. Pam Bondi wasn't just any witness appearing before a congressional committee. As Florida's Attorney General from 2011 to 2019, she had overseen election law enforcement in one of the nation's most electorally significant states. Since leaving office, she had become a prominent voice in conservative legal circles, frequently commenting on election administration issues on major news networks and serving as an advisor to Republican campaigns on voting laws and election integrity issues. Bondi's approach to election issues had been consistently conservative, emphasizing potential security vulnerabilities over concerns about ballot access. As Attorney General, she had defended Florida's controversial voter purge programs and supported restrictions on early voting that critics claimed disproportionately affected minority communities. These positions had made her both a conservative champion and a frequent target of progressive criticism. In recent months, Bondi had become particularly outspoken about alleged vulnerabilities in election systems, writing op-eds and giving interviews that warned of potential fraud risks without making specific allegations that could be factually disputed. This careful balancing act, raising concerns about election integrity without making provably false claims, had made her a particularly effective advocate for tighter voting restrictions. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett brought a different type of expertise to election issues. Before entering politics, she had built her legal career partly on voting rights cases, representing individuals and community organizations challenging barriers to ballot access. This work had given her first-hand experience with the real-world impact of voting restrictions, particularly on marginalized communities with limited resources to navigate increasingly complex requirements. Since joining Congress, Crockett had established herself as a methodical, evidence-focused questioner who rarely engaged in the theatrical confrontations that often characterized committee hearings. While some colleagues use their questioning time primarily for speeches and partisan attacks, Crockett typically built careful factual foundations before revealing the contradictions or inconsistencies she intended to expose. The clash between Bondi and Crockett thus represented more than routine partisan disagreement. It was a confrontation between fundamentally different approaches to election policy: theoretical vulnerability versus empirical impact, abstract security, concerns versus documented access barriers, institutional authority versus lived experience and community perspective. Ms. Bondi, Crockett continued, "You've mentioned significant opportunities for fraud in our current systems. I'm interested in understanding the scale of this problem based on empirical evidence rather than theoretical possibilities." She glanced down at her notes. "During your 8 years as Florida's Attorney General, approximately how many cases of voter fraud did your office prosecute?" The question was straightforward, but potentially problematic for Bondi. As the state's former top law enforcement officer, she couldn't claim ignorance about prosecution statistics from her tenure, but the actual numbers would likely undermine her narrative about widespread vulnerabilities. "I don't have the exact figures in front of me," Bondi replied, her tone becoming slightly defensive. "But I can tell you that any fraud is too much fraud. and our focus was on prevention rather than simply prosecution after the fact. I understand your concern about prevention, Crockett responded pleasantly. But to assess the scale of the problem we're trying to prevent, wouldn't actual prosecution data be relevant? Before Bondi could respond with another generality, Crockett held up a document. I have here the official report from the Florida Division of Elections covering the 8 years of your tenure as Attorney General. According to these records, a total of 17 cases of voter fraud were prosecuted in Florida during that period, in a state with approximately 14 million registered voters. The specific citation of official Florida records, rather than statistics from advocacy groups or partisan sources, caught Bondi off guard. Her expression tightened slightly as she recognized the challenge to her narrative about significant fraud risks. Those are just the cases we could detect and prove beyond reasonable doubt, Bondi countered. The real problem is the vulnerability to fraud that goes undetected. That's an interesting point about undetected fraud. Crockett nodded. I'm curious how you would quantify something that, by definition, cannot be measured if it's undetected. The question highlighted the logical problem with claiming widespread undetected fraud, an assertion that was inherently unprovable, but often used to justify restrictions affecting millions of legitimate voters. Rather than allowing Bondi to respond with another general assertion, Crockett shifted direction. Let's talk about the specific remedies you're advocating. You've testified in support of strict photo ID requirements as essential for election security. Is that correct? Yes, Bondi responded, appearing relieved at the change of topic. Photo ID is a common-sense security measure used in many everyday situations, from boarding a plane to picking up prescriptions. It was a talking point Bondi had used effectively in previous settings, framing ID requirements as routine rather than restrictive. But Crockett was prepared for this argument as well. And would you agree that any security measure should be tailored to address actual, documented problems rather than hypothetical concerns? Generally speaking, yes, Bondi replied cautiously, though again, prevention is important. Then I'm interested in your perspective on this data, Crockett said, lifting another document. According to the comprehensive database maintained by the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank supportive of strict ID laws, of the 1,375 documented cases of voter fraud they've identified over the past 40 years nationwide, only 13 involved the type of in-person voter impersonation that photo ID requirements would prevent. The citation of data from a conservative source rather than a progressive one was strategically brilliant. Bondi couldn't easily dismiss the Heritage Foundation as biased against ID requirements, yet their own database contradicted the notion that in-person impersonation fraud was a significant problem requiring solution. That's just one organization's database, Bondi responded, her voice taking on a more defensive edge. And again, we're talking about vulnerabilities that could be exploited, not just fraud that's been caught. I understand, Crockett nodded. But if we're creating policies that will affect millions of voters, shouldn't those policies be based on documented problems rather than theoretical vulnerabilities? Particularly when studies show that up to 25 million eligible American voters lack the type of ID your proposed requirements would mandate. The question framed the issue in terms of proportionality, weighing the impact on millions of legitimate voters against prevention of a fraud type, so rare that even conservative sources had documented only 13 cases in 4 decades. Bondi's expression hardened as she recognized the corner she was being backed into. Rather than engaging with the disproportionality Crockett had highlighted, she pivoted to attack. "Congresswoman, I find it troubling that Democrats consistently oppose basic security measures for our elections while supporting them for everything else in American life," she said, her voice rising. "The only logical explanation is that you believe these requirements will disadvantage your voters, which raises serious questions about who exactly you think can't obtain identification." Her tone became increasingly accusatory. The suggestion that minority voters are somehow less capable of obtaining ID is, frankly, condescending and borderline racist. As a woman of color yourself, I'm surprised you'd promote such a patronizing narrative about your own communities. The personal attack, implying Crockett was being condescending to minority communities and questioning her representation of her own constituents, represented a significant escalation beyond policy disagreement. Several committee members looked up in surprise at the unusually direct personal challenge to a sitting member of Congress. The committee room fell silent as all eyes turned to Crockett, waiting to see how she would respond to this provocative attack. Would she react emotionally and engage in a personal counterattack? Would she demand the chairman intervene, or would she find another approach entirely? For a moment, Crockett simply looked at Bondi, her expression revealing nothing of her reaction to the personal attack. Then, without visible anger or defensiveness, she reached for a different document than the ones she had referenced previously. "Miss Bondi, thank you for raising the question of who exactly is affected by strict ID requirements," she said, her voice remaining professional and measured. "Rather than exchanging personal accusations, I think we should look at the empirical evidence on this question." She held up what appeared to be a research report. "I have here a comprehensive study conducted by the University of Wisconsin that tracked the specific impacts of that state's strict ID law after implementation. The research team conducted detailed surveys of non-voting registered voters in affected communities to determine exactly who was prevented from voting and why." Crockett turned to a specific page. According to this peer-reviewed research, among registered voters who were deterred from voting by ID requirements, 27.5% were African American compared to 8.3% of white voters. The deterrence effect was 3 times higher for black voters than white voters, even when controlling for education, income, and other demographic factors. She looked up at Bondi. "This isn't theoretical or anecdotal. It's statistically significant empirical evidence of disparate impact based on race. Exactly the concern you just characterized as condescending and borderline racist." Without raising her voice or becoming visibly emotional, Crockett had effectively turned Bondi's personal attack against her, using empirical evidence to demonstrate that the disparate racial impact wasn't a patronizing assumption, but a documented reality. Furthermore, Crockett continued, turning to another page in the report, the study found that 15.7% of eligible voters earning less than $25,000 annually were deterred, compared to 2.3% of voters earning over $100,000. Among those deterred, 61% attempted to obtain compliant ID, but were unable to do so due to documentation requirements, fees for supporting documents, or inability to take time off work during DMV hours. She looked directly at Bondi. These aren't people unwilling to make an effort. They're citizens facing structural barriers that wealthier Americans don't encounter, another documented reality rather than a condescending assumption. The factual precision of Crockett's response, citing specific percentages from peer-reviewed research rather than general assertions, had effectively neutralized Bondi's accusation, while simultaneously providing evidence that directly contradicted her dismissal of disparate impact concerns. Recognizing that her attack had backfired, Bondi attempted to pivot again. Even if there are disparities in who currently has ID, that's an argument for helping people obtain identification, not for abandoning security requirements altogether. I couldn't agree more about helping people obtain identification, Crockett responded immediately. Which is why I'm curious about your position on the democracy enhancement provisions in the very bill we're discussing today. She held up a copy of the legislation. Section 302 provides for automatic voter registration. Section 307 establishes same-day registration. And Section 303 specifically allocates funding for mobile ID units to visit underserved communities and provide free photo identification. These provisions would address the very concerns you just raised, ensuring security while removing barriers to participation. Crockett looked directly at Bondi. Yet, in your submitted testimony, you explicitly oppose these provisions. Could you explain why you oppose the very solutions that would address the concern you just identified? It was a devastating follow-up that exposed a fundamental contradiction. Bondi had suggested that helping people obtain ID was the solution, yet she opposed the provisions that would actually accomplish that goal. The trap had been sprung with remarkable effectiveness. For perhaps the first time in the hearing, Bondi appeared genuinely caught off guard, uncertain how to respond to the contradiction Crockett had exposed. After a moment's hesitation, she attempted to recover. Those provisions go far beyond simply helping with identification, she said, her voice less confident than before. They create numerous other concerns about election administration and security. Which specific concerns? Crockett asked immediately. Because you just stated that helping people obtain ID would address your primary objection to removing strict ID requirements. If the bill does exactly that, what other documented problems are you referring to? The follow-up question exposed another logical problem. Having identified ID accessibility as the key issue, Bondi now needed to articulate other specific concerns or admit that her opposition wasn't based on the reasoning she had just provided. Before Bondi could formulate a response, Crockett's time expired. But the damage had been done. What had begun as Bondi's confident attack on Crockett's motives and representation had been transformed into an exposure of contradictions in her own position, all without Crockett ever responding in kind to the personal nature of Bondi's accusations. As questioning moved to the next committee member, the dynamic in the hearing room had fundamentally shifted. Republican members who had planned to invite Bondi to expand on her security concerns now adjusted their questions to avoid the contradictions Crockett had exposed. Democratic members, meanwhile, built upon the empirical foundation Crockett had established, pressing Bondi on the documented impacts of the restrictions she supported. By the time the hearing concluded 3 hours later, the exchange between Bondi and Crockett had become its defining moment. Video clips of the confrontation, particularly Crockett's calm citation of empirical evidence directly contradicting Bondi's accusations, spread rapidly across social media platforms, accumulating millions of views within hours. Political analysts from across the spectrum noted the effectiveness of Crockett's approach. What made Congresswoman Crockett's response so powerful wasn't just the evidence she presented, though that was compelling, observed a veteran congressional reporter. It was her ability to respond to a personal attack with factual precision rather than emotional reaction. She never took Bondi's bait by making counter-accusations or becoming defensive, instead redirecting the conversation to an empirical evidence that directly contradicted Bondi's claims. Conservative commentators were more measured in their assessment, but many acknowledged the tactical error in Bondi's approach. The personal attack on Congresswoman Crockett's representation of minority communities created an opening for her to present research on disparate impact that might otherwise have received less attention, noted a Republican strategist. It transformed what could have been a debate about theoretical security concerns into a discussion of documented disparities, ground that favors the Democratic position. For Bondi, the exchange represented a rare public misstep. Known for her media discipline and messaging effectiveness, she had instead been maneuvered into a position where her own contradictions were exposed for a national audience. In a telling sign of the exchange's impact, Bondi declined multiple requests for interviews in the days following the hearing, a marked departure from her usual eagerness to expand on her testimony in media appearances. For Crockett, the confrontation elevated her national profile significantly. Already respected within Congress for her methodical questioning style, the viral nature of her evidence-based dismantling of Bondi's arguments introduced her to a much broader audience. Legal and policy organizations began seeking her participation in panels and discussions, recognizing her ability to translate complex issues like voting rights into accessible explanations without sacrificing analytical rigor. What Congresswoman Crockett demonstrated wasn't just good committee questioning, noted a voting rights attorney. It was a master class in how to respond to political attacks with substantive evidence, focusing on documented facts rather than personal accusations, and exposing contradictions through precise questioning rather than emotional reaction. Perhaps most significantly, the exchange altered the broader public discourse around voter ID and other election restrictions. In subsequent media coverage, reporters began asking more specific questions about the empirical evidence for fraud claims and the documented impacts of proposed restrictions, rather than simply presenting the issue as a partisan disagreement between abstract principles of security and access. The most important impact of the Bondi-Crockett exchange wasn't just the viral moment, observed an election policy expert. It was that it helped reframe the entire voting rights debate around empirical evidence rather than theoretical concerns or partisan talking points. When policies affecting millions of voters are required to be justified by actual evidence rather than hypothetical scenarios, the entire discussion improves. For political observers, the confrontation between Bondi and Crockett represented something larger than a single committee exchange. It demonstrated how prepared, evidence-based responses could overcome even the most provocative personal attacks. Bondi's approach, combining theoretical security concerns with personal accusations when challenged, had been systematically dismantled by Crockett's calm insistence on empirical evidence and logical consistency. In doing so, Crockett had provided a template for effective policy advocacy that contrasted sharply with the personal attacks that often characterized political debates over voting rights. Rather than responding to Bondi's accusations with counterattacks, she had elevated the discussion to focus on documented facts and logical consistency, ground where her position was significantly stronger. The Bondi-Crockett exchange reminds us that in policy debates, as in courtrooms, evidence ultimately matters more than accusation, concluded a political analyst. When confronted with specific, well-documented facts that contradict both theoretical concerns and personal attacks, even the most skilled advocates can find themselves in untenable positions. For viewers across the political spectrum, the exchange offered a rare and valuable glimpse of how policy discussions could function at their best, not as exchanges of accusations and partisan talking points, but as substantive examinations of empirical evidence and logical consistency. And in a political environment where voting rights debates had often generated more heat than light, Crockett's methodical dismantling of Bondi's attack had provided something increasingly rare but immensely valuable: a victory for empirical evidence over theoretical concerns, for documented reality over hypothetical risks, for factual precision over personal accusation. If you found this breakdown of how Congresswoman Crockett turned Pam Bondi's personal attack against her through empirical evidence valuable, make sure to like and subscribe to our channel. We bring you the most revealing political confrontations with context and analysis you won't find elsewhere. Hit that notification bell to stay updated on our latest videos showing how preparation and factual precision can overcome even the most provocative political attacks.